Chapter 1. The tension ignites. The Nightball Stadium roared with the fervor of the crowd, divided between cheers for the Crescent House and Eclipse House teams. Adrian Velder stood on the sidelines, his sharp gaze fixated on Ronan Lyric, whose fiery presence seemed to ignite the entire arena. The tension was palpable as the whistle blew, and the game descended into chaos. It wasn't long before Adrian and Ronan collided, both refusing to yield. Their rivalry, already legendary, boiled over into a brawl. Ronan growled, his claws extending in warning as Adrian's fangs glinted dangerously. "Stay out of my way, leech," Ronan spat, shoving Adrian. The vampire captain smirked coldly, his calm demeanor masking his brewing anger. "You're all bark, wolf. Care to prove otherwise?" The fight escalated, their raw alpha power electrifying the field. Teammates and referees scrambled to separate them. Just as the confrontation reached its peak, a figure appeared between them. Cale Draven, the new transfer student, shoved both alphas apart with shocking ease. His golden eyes blazed as he spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "Enough. You're embarrassing yourselves." Both Adrian and Ronan froze, their instincts recognizing a power they couldn't place. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but the game resumed with strained tension. Later that night, Adrian stood in his dorm, replaying the encounter in his mind. His hand unconsciously traced the faint bruise from Ronan's punch, a rare smile ghosting his lips. Across campus, Ronan slammed his fist into a locker, growling in frustration. Both captains swore vengeance, not just against each other, but against the mysterious Cale, whose arrival had disrupted everything. Chapter 2. The Transfer Student. As soon as Riven Draven stepped onto the campus of Lunarion Academy, whispers spread like wildfire. Despite his status as an Omega, Riven's presence carried an air of dominance. Adrian Velder and Ronan Lyric, the two alphas who ruled the school in their own right, couldn't help but feel the pull toward the new student. His strength was undeniable, his aura cutting through the tension that had already built between them. At first, both Adrian and Ronan tried to ignore him, but they soon realized that Riven wasn't someone who could be easily brushed aside. During a grueling training session, something shifted. As Adrian and Ronan clashed with each other in an unspoken rivalry, Riven stood in the center, watching them intently. Then, when their energies clashed in a burst of raw power, Riven intervened. He easily suppressed both alphas with an almost casual flick of his wrist. The Omega's dominance unnerved them both. Adrian felt a flicker of vulnerability that he hadn't experienced in years, while Ronan's suspicion only grew stronger. How could an Omega possess such strength? It was clear to both alphas that something about Riven was different, and neither of them was prepared for what came next. That night, Adrian found himself standing in a quiet corner of the campus, where Riven awaited him. "Are you frightened, vampire?" Riven's voice was calm but laced with something dangerous. Adrian could feel his pulse quicken, his usual confidence faltering in the face of Riven's power. "You've forgotten what it means to be alpha, haven't you?" Riven's challenge hung in the air, but before Adrian could respond, Riven turned and walked away. Meanwhile, Ronan, watching from a distance, felt his jealousy flare. What was it about Riven that had both alphas on edge? Chapter 3. A Dangerous Encounter. The tension between Adrian and Ronan reached a breaking point during a training session at Crescent House. Both alphas were forced to set aside their rivalry when a rogue pack of hunters threatened the academy, and they knew they needed to work together. However, their strained cooperation only amplified the underlying animosity between them, and the energy between them became dangerously volatile. Ronan's voice was low and filled with distrust as he confronted Adrian. "What are you doing here, vampire?" Adrian, his eyes cold and steely, shot back. "The same thing as you, wolf. Protecting what's mine." Their words were a challenge, and the simmering tension between them felt almost unbearable. Despite their shared goal, the attraction, mixed with rage and pride, only deepened their rivalry. But the hunters were closing in, forcing them to focus on the immediate threat. As the two alphas fought side by side, their movements were in sync. There was a strange sort of connection forming between them, one that neither was willing to acknowledge. Riven stood at the edge of the field, watching silently, a hint of amusement dancing in his eyes. In a blur of motion, Riven intervened, using his power to effortlessly subdue the hunters. Adrian and Ronan stood there, stunned by the Omega's overwhelming strength. "You've done well," Riven said, his voice dripping with irony. Adrian clenched his fists, the sting of his pride evident in his posture. "You didn't need to help us," he muttered, but his words felt hollow. Ronan's jealousy burned beneath the surface, his thoughts racing. Neither of them knew what to make of Riven, but one thing was certain. The Omega had left his mark on them both, and the bond between the two alphas was growing stronger with every passing day. Chapter 4. Forbidden Longing. The unspoken bond between Adrian and Ronan became increasingly difficult to ignore. Their rivalry, once a source of pride, now felt hollow. The attraction between them simmered just beneath the surface, ready to ignite at any moment. But it wasn't just the heat of competition that drew them together. It was something far more dangerous, something that neither was prepared to face. During a high-stakes nightball game, the tension between them finally reached its peak. As Adrian executed a daring move, he collided with Ronan mid-air, both of them falling to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Time seemed to slow as their eyes locked, and the world around them faded away. Neither could look away. Adrian's breath caught in his throat, and Ronan felt a pulse of heat rush through him. It happened without warning. Their lips met, and the kiss was fierce, desperate. Adrian's fangs scraped against Ronan's lip, sending a shock of electricity through both of them. Ronan's growl was primal, hands gripping Adrian's shoulders as he pulled him closer. But just as quickly, reality crashed back, and they broke apart. Both of them were panting, confusion and anger swirling in their gazes. "What the hell was that?" Ronan hissed, his voice low with frustration and desire. Adrian wiped his lips with the back of his hand, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. "I don't know," he muttered, the uncertainty in his voice betraying his usual confidence. Across the field, Riven watched them with a small, knowing smile. The bond between the two alphas was undeniable now, and Riven was certain that neither would be able to walk away from it. Chapter 5. Unveiling the Past. The tension continued to build as Adrian and Ronan's bond deepened, though neither was willing to fully acknowledge it. Meanwhile, Riven's quiet presence seemed to hover over them, his power growing with each passing day. It wasn't long before the alphas found themselves caught in a web of confusion and desire, unsure of what to do with the growing pull between them. One evening, Riven finally revealed the truth. In the darkened woods outside the academy, he confronted the two alphas. His eyes glowed with an eerie light as he spoke in a voice that was both soothing and ominous. "Do you feel it yet?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Adrian and Ronan. Both alphas were still unsure, but the air around them seemed charged with something ancient, something they couldn't quite place. Riven's smile was tinged with sadness. "The bond between you two, it's ancient. It's fated." The words hit like a slap in the face, and for a moment, Adrian and Ronan could only stare at him in disbelief. Their ancestors, vampire and werewolf, had been mates, torn apart by betrayal. The connection between the two alphas was no mere coincidence. It was the resurrection of an old bond that neither could escape. As the realization sank in, the world around them seemed to shift. Riven's voice was low but filled with warning. "You can't fight it. You'll either accept it, or it will destroy you." The words hung heavy in the air. Adrian and Ronan exchanged a long, uncertain glance. The bond was real, and neither knew how to handle it. But one thing was certain. They were now tangled in a dangerous game that neither could win without consequences. Chapter 6. Temptation's Grip. Days passed since the revelation of their bond, but Adrian and Ronan found themselves unable to escape the magnetic pull between them. The rivalry, once their source of strength, now felt like a distraction. They were drawn to each other like fire and ice, struggling to resist but never truly able to pull away. The more they tried to ignore their growing feelings, the more intense it became. One night, during a midnight practice session, Adrian and Ronan found themselves alone on the field. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if the universe itself was aware of the tension simmering between them. As they clashed in a test of strength, the intensity of their movements brought them dangerously close. Adrian could feel the heat radiating from Ronan's body, his scent intoxicating, and before he knew it, their lips met once more, igniting a spark neither could control. This time, there was no hesitation. Their kiss was desperate, raw, filled with everything they had been holding back. Adrian's fangs grazed Ronan's skin, and the wolf alpha responded with a guttural growl. But as quickly as it had begun, the kiss was broken. Ronan stepped back, his chest heaving with breathless anger. "We can't do this," he muttered, but the truth was he didn't want to stop. Neither of them did. Riven, unseen in the shadows, had been watching them. His smile was faint, but there was something in his gaze that both unsettled and intrigued the alphas. "You're both fools," he said, stepping into the light. "You think you can fight fate, but it will break you before you even realize it." His words were a chilling reminder that they were tangled in something far beyond their control. Chapter 7. The Underworld's Call. The days following their encounter were filled with tension, not just between Adrian and Ronan but throughout the entire academy. Riven's words lingered in their minds, and despite their best efforts to focus on their duties, the alphas couldn't shake the growing connection between them. It felt as though something was pulling them deeper into a world neither of them had fully understood, a world that threatened everything they knew. On a stormy evening, as the academy's gates creaked under the weight of the weather, the ground shook. The earth beneath their feet trembled, and the very air around them felt charged with a dangerous energy. Something from their past was calling them. The vampires and wolves who had lived before them, their bloodlines, were reaching out, awakening old powers. The ancient bond that tied Adrian and Ronan to one another was growing stronger, and there was no escape from it. Adrian and Ronan met in the Academy's library, where old tomes spoke of an ancient ritual, a test that had once bound their kind together. It was the very reason for the animosity between their ancestors. They had been forced to choose between their love and their loyalty to their respective people. But the bond between the alphas had never truly been severed. It had simply lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. "This is a mistake," Adrian muttered, his fingers brushing against the pages of the ancient texts. Ronan was beside him, his face set with determination. "It's not a mistake. It's our destiny." Their hands brushed, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The energy between them surged, and neither knew whether they were ready to face what lay ahead. Chapter 8. The First Test. The revelation of their destiny marked the beginning of the end for the alphas. Despite their fears, Adrian and Ronan had no choice but to confront the inevitable. Riven had warned them, but his presence was not enough to calm the storm that was brewing inside them. Their bond was growing, and the first test was upon them, a ritual that would either solidify their connection or tear them apart. It was an ancient challenge, one that would force them to face their deepest fears and their most primal instincts. As the sun set and the moon rose, they found themselves standing on the outskirts of the academy, at the site of the ritual. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of their ancestors' power hung heavily in the air. "You can't back out now," Riven said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable force. Adrian's heart raced as he glanced at Ronan. "Are you sure we have to do this?" he asked, but his voice faltered, betraying his uncertainty. Ronan met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "If we don't, we'll lose everything. Our connection. Our power." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and as they stepped into the circle, the ground beneath them seemed to pulse with life. The ritual began, and the world around them seemed to warp. Time became fluid, reality bending as they were plunged into a world between worlds. Their bodies trembled with the force of the ritual, and the bond between them became palpable, an overwhelming presence that threatened to consume them. Adrian could feel Ronan's heartbeat against his own, the wolf's primal energy rising to meet his. There was no going back now. Chapter 9. Breaking Point. As the ritual continued, Adrian and Ronan found themselves facing their darkest fears. The world around them twisted, their pasts and futures colliding in a blur of emotions. The bond between them, once a spark of attraction, had become a living, breathing thing, and the power it carried was overwhelming. Adrian felt himself being pulled into Ronan's psyche, unable to escape the torrent of emotions that surged between them. "Stop," Adrian gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts. "This isn't right." But his words fell on deaf ears as Ronan's eyes darkened, his wolf side beginning to take control. "You can't fight this," Ronan growled, his voice filled with both desire and anger. "We were meant to be." The intensity of the moment sent a shockwave through both of them, and Adrian's fangs lengthened, a sign that the ritual was working. The physical pull between them was undeniable, but it was the mental connection that was the true test. Adrian's mind raced as he struggled to maintain control, but Ronan's presence was all-consuming. Memories of their past lives, lives they had never known, flashed before their eyes. They saw themselves as they had been, centuries ago, torn apart by forces beyond their control. In that moment, something snapped inside Adrian. He reached out, his hand finding Ronan's, and the world around them exploded in a blinding flash. When the light faded, they found themselves standing together in the circle, but everything had changed. The ritual was complete, and their bond had been solidified. But at what cost? Neither of them knew yet, but they knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 10. The Aftermath. Adrian and Ronan stood in the aftermath of the ritual, breathing heavily. The air was thick with energy, and their hearts raced in unison, a constant reminder of the bond that now connected them. Adrian's skin was flushed with the aftermath of the ritual, his body humming with unfamiliar power. He glanced at Ronan, whose wolf eyes glowed faintly in the dark. The transformation was complete, and the weight of their bond was settling into their bones. Ronan stepped back, his face a mixture of confusion and desire. "We're really in this now, aren't we?" His voice was rough, as though the strain of the ritual had worn him thin. Adrian nodded, unable to find the right words. The connection between them was so intense, so undeniable, that it left him speechless. Every thought, every breath seemed tied to Ronan in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Suddenly, Riven's voice broke through the heavy silence. "You're both fools," he said, stepping into the circle with a smirk on his face. "You think you can control something like this? The bond has already started to change you. Your instincts will grow stronger, and soon, you won't even recognize yourselves." His words struck like a cold gust of wind, but Adrian and Ronan stood their ground. "We'll handle it," Adrian said, his voice firmer than he felt. "We'll fight this together." But deep down, a part of him feared that their fight might be in vain. The bond was powerful, and the more they resisted, the more it pulled at them. Adrian glanced at Ronan, silently wondering if they had made the right choice. But it was too late now. Chapter 11. The Silent War. The days after the ritual were nothing short of chaotic. The academy, once a place of stability, was now rife with tension. The other students could sense the shift in the air. The unspoken rivalry between the two alphas was no longer just an academic contest, but something far more dangerous. Adrian and Ronan's relationship had become the center of attention, but the alphas weren't the only ones feeling the heat. As the competition between the vampires and wolves intensified, the two teams found themselves at odds more than ever before. The games, once filled with friendly banter and fierce competition, now felt like a battleground, each team pushing the limits in an attempt to outdo the other. But beneath the surface, there was more at play. The connection between Adrian and Ronan had created a rift that neither side could ignore. At practice one night, Adrian and Ronan collided in a fierce game of nightball, their bodies moving with the primal energy that now flowed between them. They pushed each other harder, faster, but neither of them could outrun the growing tension. Their moves were synchronized, as though the bond had seeped into every aspect of their lives, and yet, with every pass of the ball, there was an undercurrent of frustration that neither could fully explain. "What are we doing, Ronan?" Adrian asked, his voice barely a whisper as they stood on the field, both dripping with sweat. "This isn't just about the game anymore." Ronan's eyes flickered with something dangerous. "I know," he growled. "But we're already in this. There's no going back." Chapter 12. Unraveling the Past. Adrian and Ronan could feel the strain of their bond in every moment, every glance they exchanged. The emotional weight of it was beginning to show, but neither knew how to stop it. Their rivalry had turned into something much darker, and the more they fought against it, the deeper the pull became. Neither one of them knew how to confront what was happening, but they couldn't ignore it any longer. One evening, in a quiet corner of the academy, they met once more in secret, their hands brushing as they approached each other. The atmosphere between them crackled with energy, as if their very presence was an act of defiance against the forces pulling them together. Adrian's gaze locked onto Ronan's, and for a brief moment, they both understood the danger that their connection posed. "Tell me you're not feeling this," Ronan said, his voice low and urgent. "Tell me it's not just me." Adrian swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "I feel it too," he admitted. "I can't ignore it anymore." "But what does it mean?" Ronan's expression darkened, his jaw tightening as the weight of the situation settled in. "It means everything has changed," he said, "and we have no choice but to deal with it. Together." Chapter 13. A Dangerous Game. As the bond between Adrian and Ronan grew stronger, so did the challenges they faced. The rivalry between the vampire and wolf teams reached new heights, and it wasn't just confined to the game of nightball anymore. The academy became a battleground, both teams trying to outdo each other at every turn. But in the midst of all the chaos, there was one undeniable truth. Adrian and Ronan were no longer just rivals, they were entwined in a fate neither of them could escape. At practice one evening, tempers flared as the alphas faced off once again, the tension palpable in the air. Adrian and Ronan's movements were sharp, precise, but there was something different about them now. Every pass, every tackle, felt like a reminder of the bond that had tied them together. And as their bodies collided, a dangerous spark ignited. "I don't want to do this," Adrian said, his voice filled with frustration as he backed away from Ronan. "But I can't stop it. I can't stop feeling this pull." Ronan's eyes narrowed, his wolf instincts taking over. "Then don't. Let's see where it takes us." The words hung in the air, charged with raw desire and undeniable power. But even as the connection between them deepened, so did the danger. Neither of them knew what the future held, but they were already too far gone to turn back. Chapter 14. The Price of Power. The days were becoming a blur for Adrian and Ronan. The tension between them had escalated to an unbearable level, and no matter how much they tried to focus on the game, their bond was impossible to ignore. The academy had become a constant reminder of their rivalry, with each passing day deepening the connection they shared. As the bond between the vampire alpha and wolf alpha strengthened, so did the pressure from their respective teams. On the field, Adrian could feel the eyes of his teammates burning into his back. They were watching him, waiting for him to slip. They wanted to see how far he would go with this bond to Ronan. Ronan, too, could feel the weight of his pack's disapproval. The wolf in him growled at the feeling of betrayal, but the bond kept him tethered to Adrian, unwilling to let go. One night, after an intense practice, Adrian found himself alone in the locker room, pacing restlessly. Ronan followed him in, his steps heavy, the air between them thick with tension. "We can't keep doing this," Adrian said, his voice breaking. "This bond, it's consuming us. It's affecting everything." Ronan stepped closer, his breath warm against Adrian's neck. "Maybe we're just starting to understand how powerful we really are together," he whispered, his voice low and intense. "But if you want to walk away, I won't stop you. But you should know, neither of us can ever truly be free again." Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. The battle within Adrian was reaching its peak. Every part of him screamed for freedom, to break away from the bond with Ronan and return to the life he knew. But every time he tried, his body ached, as if the bond itself was keeping him locked in place. The pull was too strong, and the more he resisted, the more his mind became consumed by thoughts of Ronan. Ronan, on the other hand, was torn between the desire to protect Adrian and the fear of losing himself. The wolf inside him had never felt so confused. He had always been in control, but now, with Adrian, it was as though he was no longer the alpha he once was. Every instinct screamed at him to take control, to push Adrian into submission, but there was a part of him, one he couldn't ignore, that wanted something more than just power. "I'm not going to break, Ronan," Adrian said, his voice filled with resolve. "I can't. We can't keep going like this. We're both changing, and I'm not sure who we're becoming anymore." Ronan's eyes softened for a moment, and then he pulled Adrian closer. "I don't know how to fix this either," he admitted. "But I'm not going to let you go. Not without a fight." Chapter 16. Collision Course. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. Adrian and Ronan's bond continued to deepen, and with it came an insatiable need to dominate and claim each other. The balance of power between them shifted constantly, and neither could tell where one ended and the other began. Their rivalry had morphed into something darker, something far more dangerous than either had anticipated. The nightball game became more than just a sport, it was an arena where their unresolved emotions boiled over. Adrian's control faltered, and in a moment of rage, he tackled Ronan harder than he ever had before, knocking them both to the ground. The crowd's cheers faded as the two alphas locked eyes, the bond between them crackling with tension. "You want this," Ronan growled, his voice thick with lust and frustration. "You know you do." Adrian's breath hitched, the truth of Ronan's words hanging in the air. He didn't know what he wanted anymore, only that the bond was consuming him, pulling him closer to Ronan with every passing second. Before Adrian could respond, a growl from the stands caught their attention. It was Riven, his eyes blazing with fury. "Enough," he barked. "This ends now. You two are only digging your own graves." But the words barely registered in Adrian's mind as his eyes remained locked on Ronan, the dangerous connection between them unstoppable. Chapter 17. The Cost of Choice. Adrian and Ronan had reached a breaking point, and yet they found themselves drawn together with a force neither could deny. The rivalry had become secondary to the bond that had formed between them, but there was a price to be paid. With every passing day, the connection became more intense, more volatile. The effects were beginning to show on both their bodies and their minds. Adrian lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, his heart racing. He couldn't escape the pull of the bond, no matter how hard he tried. Every thought, every heartbeat was connected to Ronan. It felt suffocating, and yet, at the same time, it was the only thing that kept him tethered to the world. Ronan was no better. He paced the halls of the academy, unable to shake the feeling that he was losing control. The wolf inside him raged against the bond, but the alpha in him knew that surrendering to it was the only way to keep the peace. But peace was a distant dream now. "You have to decide, Adrian," Ronan said one evening, his voice low and dangerous. "Either we fight this bond or we embrace it fully. There's no middle ground." Adrian met his gaze, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision. "I don't know what's worse," he murmured. "Fighting this or losing myself in it too." Chapter 18. Torn Between Worlds. The days were a blur of confusion for Adrian and Ronan. The bond between them was growing stronger, and both alphas found themselves caught in a dangerous dance of power and desire. Each moment they spent apart only seemed to fuel the longing that built between them. Yet, every time they came together, their rivalry resurfaced, complicating the fragile truce they had forged. Adrian was haunted by the notion that he was losing himself to Ronan. The more they embraced the bond, the more he felt his identity slipping away. His sense of control, the one thing he had always prided himself on, was dissolving, piece by piece. Ronan wasn't the problem, though. It was the bond. It was taking everything from them. One evening, as they stood facing each other in the darkened academy hall, Adrian clenched his fists. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "I feel like I'm being consumed by this bond. We have to end it before it destroys us." Ronan took a step forward, his presence overwhelming. "You can't escape what we are, Adrian. We're bound, whether we want it or not. If you think I'm letting go of this, you're wrong." Chapter 19. The Push and Pull. The following days were a constant tug-of-war between Adrian and Ronan. Every time they came close to resolving their issues, the bond between them would intensify, bringing them back into conflict. Neither of them knew how to fight it. It was as if they were being pulled toward each other with an invisible force, and the more they resisted, the stronger the connection became. In the midst of all this chaos, the rivalry between their teams continued to escalate. Nightball had become the battleground not just for victory, but for dominance over each other. Adrian and Ronan pushed each other to the edge, both determined to prove that they were the strongest, the most capable. But each win, each victory, only seemed to push them further into the abyss. One night, after a particularly brutal practice, Adrian stood in the middle of the field, panting and drenched in sweat. "Why does it feel like everything is falling apart?" he muttered. Ronan approached him from behind, his voice low. "Because it is. But we're in this together, whether we like it or not." The words hit Adrian harder than he expected. The bond was not just about power, it was about them, their connection, their future. But what kind of future could they have if it meant losing themselves in the process? Chapter 20. Descent into Darkness. The more Adrian and Ronan tried to fight the bond, the more it consumed them. The academy, their teams, and their lives seemed to fall apart at the seams. Their power struggles were no longer limited to the field, they had seeped into every aspect of their lives. Every moment of intimacy, every glance, every touch was charged with the energy of their unspoken emotions. Adrian had always prided himself on his independence, but now, every time he looked at Ronan, his thoughts became clouded with desire. It was as if his body no longer belonged to him. The bond had taken control, and he had no idea how to get it back. Ronan, too, was struggling with his own feelings. The alpha in him longed to dominate, but the wolf within him was pulling him toward something softer, something deeper. One night, after an argument between their teams, Adrian and Ronan found themselves alone in the locker room. "I don't know who I am anymore," Adrian said, his voice hoarse. "I don't recognize myself when I look in the mirror." Ronan stepped forward, his expression dark with frustration. "Maybe you don't need to recognize yourself. Maybe you just need to accept who you are now. Who we are together." Chapter 21. Into the Abyss. As Adrian and Ronan's bond grew more intense, so did the consequences. Their connection was no longer a secret, it was obvious to everyone around them. The academy whispered about the two alphas, their rivalry, and their undeniable pull toward each other. Some of their teammates began to question their loyalty, and tensions within both teams reached a boiling point. Ronan could feel the strain of the constant pressure. His pack was beginning to grow restless, wondering if their alpha was distracted by Adrian. And Adrian's team was becoming divided, with some supporting him and others feeling betrayed. The alphas had always been pillars of strength, but now they were fractured, unsure of who they were or what they wanted. One evening, as they walked through the darkened academy courtyard, Ronan turned to Adrian. "We need to make a choice," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "We can't keep running from this bond. It's either us, or everything else." Adrian's heart raced. "But if we choose this, we lose everything we've worked for. Our teams, our futures." Ronan's gaze softened. "I'm willing to risk it all if it means having you." Chapter 22. A dangerous proposition. As the days wore on, Adrian and Ronan found themselves at the edge of a precipice. Their bond was no longer something they could control. It was a force of nature, pushing them to their limits. The power they held together was undeniable, but so was the cost. Both knew that if they chose to embrace the bond fully, there would be no turning back. The tension between them reached a breaking point during a late-night confrontation. "You don't get it, do you?" Adrian snapped. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone around us. We're tearing this academy apart, Ronan. We're destroying everything we've built." Ronan's eyes darkened. "And what if that's what we're meant to do?" he challenged. "What if we were never meant to be anything other than this, together?" Adrian took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know if I can live with that," he admitted. "I'm not sure I can be who you want me to be." Ronan reached for him, his hand brushing Adrian's cheek. "I don't want you to be anyone else. Just you, Adrian. Just you." Chapter 23. The Reckoning. The atmosphere between Adrian and Ronan grew heavier as the days went on. The bond between them had reached a point where ignoring it was no longer an option. Both of them could feel the gravity of the situation pulling them down, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. Their lives had become a tightrope walk between desire and destruction, with no clear path forward. At practice, Adrian could barely focus. His mind was consumed with Ronan, with the constant pull of their bond. Every time they crossed paths, every time their eyes met, the connection seemed to spark, drawing them closer to a dangerous precipice. The rivalry between their teams was now a distant memory. The real war was within them. That night, in the solitude of their rooms, Adrian could feel the walls closing in. "Ronan, I can't do this anymore," he whispered to himself. "I can't keep living like this." He stood before the mirror, his reflection a stranger to him. How had it all gone so wrong? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. When Adrian opened it, Ronan stood there, his expression unreadable. "Then let's stop pretending, Adrian," Ronan said, his voice low. "Let's face what we are." Chapter 24. Surrender. The decision was made. Adrian and Ronan could no longer fight what they were, alphas bound by a bond neither of them understood, but both of them felt. The consequences of their choice were undeniable, and as they stood at the edge of their relationship, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Their rivalry had dissolved into something far deeper, something that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every moment together was laced with tension, and every touch seemed to ignite a fire between them. But even as they gave into the bond, they both struggled with the loss of control, with the fear of losing themselves in each other. One night, after an intense and passionate encounter, Adrian lay in Ronan's arms, his breath shallow. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "We're both losing ourselves." Ronan stroked his hair, his own thoughts conflicted. Maybe losing ourselves is the only way to truly find each other. Chapter 25. Unraveled. As the bond between Adrian and Ronan grew, so did the consequences. Their teams, their academy, and their futures were all hanging by a thread. The strength of their connection had become undeniable, but so had the chaos it brought. Every aspect of their lives was spiraling out of control, and they were helpless to stop it. One fateful night, the tension between their packs reached a boiling point. A confrontation between their teammates escalated into an all-out brawl, fueled by the resentment that had been building for weeks. Adrian and Ronan found themselves caught in the middle, unable to stop the destruction that was unfolding before them. In the midst of the chaos, Adrian and Ronan stood facing each other, their eyes locked. "This is it, isn't it?" Adrian said, his voice raw with emotion. "We can't fix this." Ronan took a step forward, his hand reaching for Adrian's. "We can't fix everything, but we can face it together."